I think others might like to learn from it in the future. I'm going to invite you, if you haven't, to turn your screen on. And the reason I say that is I'm reminded how much connection matters, personal connection. And while this is sort of a weak substitute for personal connection, it's for some of us the best thing we have right now. So if you are able, if you have the technology, and if you're not wrestling with your kids, go ahead and or if you are wrestling with your kids, that could be very entertaining for the rest of us. Turn your screen on if you can. We might do a quick just introduction of who's here and what kind of organization they're a part of, because I think it's just always good to know who's in the room. So let's start with George.
Hi there. My name is George DeVita. I'm a local entrepreneur here in town. I'm kind of looking for my next thing. And my very next thing will be going running after this meeting. So that's why I'm wearing this jersey. But yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing a lot from you today and learning from everybody.
Great, thanks. Erin Hawkins.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Erin Hawkins. I work with the Visitor Center.
Harumi.
Hi, good morning. Can you see me?
Yes.
Harumi Anderson. Hi, I do biohacking business. So I say always, let's change your DNA expressions for the better way. You cannot say it's in the genes anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Harumi. Brian.
Sure. Morning, everybody. Brian Rushton with LHP Data Analytics and IoT Solutions. So we've actually talked with Steve's team a little bit before. This is cool stuff. You guys are going to enjoy this.
This is good. Debbie Kelly. Unmute. Debbie, are you there? All right. How about Chelsea? Chelsea, are you there? You're muted.
Sorry about that. Okay, I'm here. Hello. My name is Chelsea Alarcon. I work for Trine University as a director of admissions, and then I also own a cleaning business called OCD.
Thank you. Rhonda Fisher.
Hey, good morning. It's Rhonda Fisher. I work for the Community Education Coalition, facilitating the industry sector meetings.
Good to have you, Rhonda. How about Ola? Ola Johnson.
Hi. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Hi. Hi. I'm Ola Johnson. I work with Promise Incorporated here, but I'm also a software developer, specifically for machine learning and AI, and I'm super excited to hear about about what you guys are going to be discussing today.
This is great. Great to have you, Ola.
Thank you.
Let's see who
Nice to be back.
Good to be back. Scott Redelman.
Hi, I'm Scott Redelman. I work for Toyota Material Handling, and I do lean process consulting. So, good morning.
Good morning. Todd Dickerson.
Good morning, everybody. I am trying to get my get the coffee going. Thanks for getting this. Thanks for putting this together, Cindy. I'm really looking forward to hearing the talk today. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Hi, Kelly Wingham. Tell us about you.
Hi, good morning. I see my video on, but I'm driving right now. President of Data Activation Center. We specialize in cellular IoT connections, primarily for the ag industry. And I've missed 49 Fridays. I've been traveling a lot, so looking forward to today.
We've missed you, Kelly. Thanks. I know I've missed someone, maybe somebody who's called in on the phone whose name I don't see. Anyone else? All right, we're going to jump in. I'm going to introduce Steve Wasick. And Steve, hello?
Yes, hello. Am I?
Yeah, Steve's here. There he is. Okay, so Steve is president of InfoSentient, a group he's been a part of since 2012. Steve, I'm excited to hear your story. I know Cy did a piece in the IBJ about your company and said that 120 million software written articles have been generated, and that's probably gone up since that piece appeared. And
A little bit, although a lot of our stuff has historically been sports, so it hasn't gone up as much as it normally would have.
Yeah, true. You've had a really interesting journey. I mean, you got your bachelor's in English, love a fellow English major, University of Hawaii, your law degree from Northwestern. Looks like you've lived in a couple different cities and you landed in Bloomington. So give us your journey and then tell us about InfoSentience.
Well, I got the idea. I think it's I have bounced around quite a bit, so I think it almost might make sense to start around the time when the company started, which was almost 10 years ago now. I was finishing up law school at Northwestern, and I was sitting in my bed, and I just had this idea. I never had an idea come to me quite this way, where I didn't feel like I was even thinking about it. It literally just kind of like popped into my head. And as soon as I thought about it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a great idea. But it didn't necessarily have to do with artificial intelligence or natural language generation, which is what we've focused on. It was just about fantasy sports. Like, it was very narrow. It was just like, hey, I think it would be really cool if people who had fantasy sports teams were able to get the type of coverage that regular sports get, because I was in a fantasy sports league. I was really busy, and I kind of knew what was going on with my team, but I had no idea what was going on with the rest of the league, and there wasn't a lot of engagement with some of the other friends that I was in the league with. And I thought, gosh, if you could have sort of a picture and something telling you the top bits of information of everything that was going on, that would be a really cool thing. And there's so many people playing fantasy sports. I thought, oh, this could be really valuable. And once I started thinking about it, I was like, oh, I guess you'd have to create this natural language generator in order to do that. And I had a very little bit of technical training. I took programming in high school and had just sort of done programming here and there at different times in my life. And so I felt like I had enough of a foundation to start programming. And so I did. Well, first I did some research, and I actually looked to see, well, are there other companies doing natural language generation? And I couldn't find any. And it turns out I was just a really bad researcher, because there were other companies who were working on it. And in fact, the main company was just down the street, like literally just down the street from where I lived, the main company in the world. And they had just given a talk at Northwestern Law School. The founder graduated from Northwestern Law School and had given a talk about what he was doing at Northwestern. So I just happened to not have seen those, because if I had seen those, I would have certainly stopped. I wouldn't have thought that I had a chance to do anything, given that there were other companies in the space. So I started
Sorry, I'm trying to get, sorry, Steve, I've interrupted you. Can you unmute yourself? I was just trying to mute everyone else. Thank you.
Oh, okay, sure.
Thanks.
So I started programming, and it became an obsession pretty quickly and took over all of my time. I put myself on a schedule of 3 days law school, 4 days programming, which is really difficult, but it got the job done. And basically by the time that I graduated, I had software that could create these fantasy sports reports. And I got a little bit of friends and family investing, which is the only money that we've taken actually so far. I launched the product, I shouldn't say I launched the product. I started calling around to CBS, and this is another time that I got a just crazy break, because I was really a nobody. I didn't even have an employee at the time. I pretended like there were employees when I was talking to them on the phone. I used we a lot. I said, oh, well, we're doing this, we're doing that. Well, there's nobody else there, but they just happened to do this thing one time and one time only, where they had an open market where you could have apps and people could buy your app on their fantasy sports system. And they said, oh, you should join this app marketplace, which ended up being a total failure. They only did it for 1 year. But we got on there and they were really impressed with what we were doing. And then they offered to have us work for them and do it for everybody in their whole system, which was a huge break. And that's sort of the beginning of the story. Sorry, I don't know if I should keep talking. That only unfortunately brings us 1 year, and I promise the other years will not be that detailed.
Well, I am curious, and I might have missed it, but how did you know how to program natural language?
Well, the good news about natural language generation is that it's all brand new, so you don't have to know anything because you got to create it.
Especially new then.
Yeah, it's still fairly brand new, but nobody was doing it essentially other than these other two companies, which they were actually very early in their journey as well. So that's part of the reason why I didn't find them, I think, is because they were just starting themselves for the most part. And in fact, this other competitor who is based out of Carolina, they started with Yahoo Sports the same year doing fantasy. That was their first product too, which is kind of interesting that we both started in that spot. Of course, ours is way better, but no big deal. But I don't. They're way richer, so who's the real winner? I think probably them. But they so they started. Yeah, one of our competitors actually started in the fantasy sports space as well. But I just hadn't heard about them, and there's no technical literature on this as far as I know, even today. So everybody's starting from scratch, and the thing about it is that it's not really technical programming in terms of there's a lot of syntax, or you have to figure out how to interface with a server or something like that. I mean, we do a lot of that now, but at the time it was really just the difficulties were all in how do you set this thing up. Like you could just set it up on a piece of paper, and once you had it set up conceptually, it was pretty easy to translate that information into computer language. And so that's part of the answer. The other answer is I did a pretty bad job in terms of the actual syntax and technical parts of it. So I feel really proud of what I put together from a conceptual standpoint and figuring out the logic and how that works. But there are definitely some growing pains in terms of my ignorance around some of the technical sides of things holding us back. So,
Steve,
that's the full answer, I'd say.
Steve, for those on the call who don't understand sort of the technical aspect, can you break it down?
Absolutely. So basically, we try to create, and maybe I should take even a further step back and say what it is that we do. I'm sorry that I started talking about the journey a little bit, and I think I got ahead of myself, but we create natural language articles that can report on any topic. And we try to make it so that these articles read exactly like an expert human being would write these articles if they were looking at a set of data. So the first step in writing the articles is ingesting a big source of data, because you need to have a lot of things going on in order to write an article about it. We then use a set of algorithms to figure out what are the most interesting things that happened in this set of data. What are the types of things that a human being, if they were looking at this data, would say, oh, that stands out, this stands out, other things stand out. And then the really tricky part is then you figure out how do you combine all these things together so that so that you can write a narrative and that it flows properly from one sentence to another, meaning that it's organized in a sort of beginning, middle, and end way where you have main points first, context flowing off of that, and that you also have language that works the way that human beings write it, which is it takes into account what came before when it's writing about each subsequent sentence. So you might have transitions saying, hey, this happened, but then however this other thing happened, or this thing also happened. Those are small examples, but there's a lot of little quirks to how humans use language that seem really trivial, but if you're reading something that doesn't take into account all those little quirks, it sounds robotic. That's what generally we mean when we say that something sounds robotic, is that it feels like every part of it is sort of by itself. and doesn't really tie into other parts of the narrative. And unfortunately, that's not just an aesthetic thing. That's actually, it's how we digest information. That's why we like good writing, is because it's really easy for our brains to understand, to follow good writing practices and create products that read well, because that's how people actually like ingesting information, and they can actually understand things much better if it's written well. So that's a really quick overview of the technology. And if I missed a step or one of them doesn't sound like it makes sense, I'm happy to dive into any part of it more.
Well, let's ask the group, are there questions at this point? Raise your hand or unmute.
Hello?
Yes, Ola.
Okay, so my first question is for your approach to this from a technical standpoint. Were you going with supervised or unsupervised learning for processing that information or the data to make it information?
So I think I missed the supervised or unsupervised. Can you repeat that? It's a little hard to hear
Yes,
you.
so can you hear me? Is this better?
Yes, it's just a little bit glitchy.
So I was asking for the approach to this from an analytical standpoint. Did you approach it from a supervised or unsupervised learning standpoint? And supervised meaning more you have some specific criteria you're looking for. Unsupervised is more you just let the data essentially you just let your analysis tell you what the trends were within the data frame.
Okay.
That's a very good question. And the answer is it's definitely supervised. We don't actually currently use any sort of machine learning in our system. Basically, what we try to do is we try to create a system where expert users, who we call narrative engineers, can put together building blocks. Ideally, building blocks that are all the way down at the conceptual level. Like, for instance, something like a trend, like you mentioned, is not just a trend, but it's actually a combination of the idea of a trend, the combination of the data that's actually supporting it. So if we have a financial product, so you might say it's a trend, it involves a commodity, it involves this amount of time, it involves going up, which is good, right? So we basically create this basket of concepts, and then we allow the system to recognize all the individual parts of that as it self-assembles into a larger narrative. So it starts with all these individual components that are all these baskets of concepts, and then it starts to assemble those into sentences, into paragraphs, and then the final report. And so and it's very interesting because almost everybody thinks that we're doing machine learning. I've never talked to any technical person who knows, who kind of knows the space, right? Who kind of knows what's going on out there, who hasn't asked some version of the question that you just asked, because I think that almost everybody is using those types of methods when they're trying to talk about AI.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do think, well, I don't know, it's a double-edged sword when you're doing something that other people aren't doing, right? It's kind of like, well, maybe we're doing something innovative, or maybe we're just dumb. But we do approach it from, I think, a pretty different angle than most people do with machine learning. And I think part of the reason for that is because language is so tricky, and because you really have to get it right sort of every time. It's really hard to, and the reasons that something's right has to be right are really complicated. The reasons for using the word however, if you could actually solve that using sort of machine learning or neural nets, like you'd be a trillionaire, right? Just to solve something that small, because it's so difficult to understand conceptually why you would use that word in every circumstance that a human being would use it. So, and we don't have that, we're not that good. So we just have to set it up from a way of doing things that's much more precise, but is more manual, right? But at the end of the day, we still think it gets the job done. We can still actually create content pretty fast, even though everything that we do is done completely supervised.
So these narrative engineers, are they kind of playing a editorial role? Explain that to me.
Basically, their job is to say, okay, here's a target narrative in terms of what it reads, like what the write-up is. And their job is to say, how do I break this down into every possible component that could go into this narrative? And then how do I build those things up so that the system understands what each of those components do and how they interact with each other?
So in the example of writing a story about a baseball game, what would that look like?
For a baseball game, there's hundreds of things that are interesting that could be happening. So you have a player who's doing really well. You have a player, but that can be broken down even further. Why did they do well? They did really well overall, or maybe they just got a key hit. What was that key hit? How, was it a single? Was it a sacrifice bunt? Was it a home run? How has that player been doing overall? How has the team been doing overall? How does this game affect the team's playoff chances? What were the lineup decisions that were made? So all of these things are the types of things that a human reporter intuitively understands because they've been following baseball all their lives and they've got a supercomputer on top of their shoulders. But we need to get our system to understand all of those components, understand how to calculate them, and then understand what are the characteristics of each of those events so that we can assemble them together into something that makes sense.
That's really helpful to allow me to understand what you're doing. Thank you.
One of the things that I think is important to point out too, and kind of goes to Ola's question, is everything that Steve's working on is based on structured data versus unstructured data. Yes. So if you just ingested the entire, Time magazine and then wrote an article about Time magazine, that's not what they're doing. And that's why it lends itself so well to sports, because you have box scores. You know exactly how many layups they had, how many three-point shots, how many free throws, who played what. So the more of that structured data that they can understand, it makes it easier for them to kind of tell that narrative.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point, Sai.
So you were taking us through your journey when we got off on this tangent, and it was an important tangent, but let's get back to your launch story.
The tangent of what we actually do. Sorry, I probably should have incorporated that at the beginning of the story, but we got the contract with CBS, and I was really excited about it. We only had one employee at the time. It was a lot of work to get everything up and running for baseball, which is actually the first sport that we did. We did baseball and then we did football. And this is 2012 when we got this contract. And, it's 2020 now. So we got this great contract with a Fortune 500 company that gives us a ton of exposure. I think that our product was clearly better than our competitor who was in the field. You could just look at it. I mean, their reports were maybe about 100, 120 words that were clearly just a template that were basically more or less the same thing every time. Ours were about 300 to 500 words that were much more dynamic, we had the ability to interview coaches. So you could actually, if you made a really good coaching decision, it would interview you and then incorporate your comments into the system. It had links to the highlights. It had pictures. I mean, we were far ahead of everybody. This is 8 years ago. So you would think, I think, given that we would have sort of taken off, I think, by now, because again, 8 years, but around 2013, really soon after we launched the product to CBS, I was feeling pretty good about myself. And I was like, hey, I know we got this technology that's pretty great and that we're ahead of the pack, but I think that I've got this idea for a better technology that could be like a really big breakthrough in artificial intelligence. And given that I sort of designed the first version of the natural language in about 9 months while I was still finishing up law school, I thought, okay, this new one maybe will take about 6 months. And so I wasn't doing any business development at that time or anything, because I was like, well, I got this new tech and I want to really focus on it and get that done. And then we'll build all the new products out on the new technology. So unfortunately, it took me 5 years to build this thing out. And it wasn't a smooth 5 years because I kept thinking, I'm almost done. I'm almost done with the tech. Like I'm almost there. This version's, this version is great. It's doing really good. And then I would get to this point where I was like, this isn't going to work. It's broken. I got to start over from scratch. And so I'd start over from scratch. And I did that, 4 full times before the 5th time. They almost each of them took about a year. And it was really difficult. It was very difficult in a lot of ways. And it really basically, put the company on ice for about 5 years. And that process was finally finished in about the middle of 2018. Around that same time, we also got some more business. We got CBS decided to expand what we were doing into actual live sports, so covering the NBA, NFL. So once I had the technology done, we had to work really, really hard to actually implement the technology for live sports, for football in the fall of 2018, which we did. And since then, we've been producing articles that go directly to the CBS Sports website that are white labeled. They say Scout staff is what they call it, but they're actually written by a computer. And during the times where we have all of our sports overlapping, we're actually writing the majority of the content in terms of numbers of articles that appear on the CBS Sports website, that people just don't know that they're reading a report that's written by a computer. So it was a cool product. And then we got product from the Chicago Mercantile Exchange doing commodity reports. We also have a product where we are working with IU Health, and we are generating automatic doctor biographies where they have about 2,000 providers. Only not even half of them had biographies, but we are producing biographies for them using their education, what they practice on, if they have different language abilities, location. And then we're also actually incorporating their patient comments and finding sort of the best ones and putting those together to talk about, hey, this doctor, their patients describe them as being very caring and thorough, and they take a lot of time with their patients or something like that. And what we can do with those is we can actually update the doctor bios every month with new comments so that they stay fresh for SEO, for search engine optimization purposes. So those are our only products right now that we've actually launched, but we've got a lot of other things in the works. And although it did take 5 years and was a lot of work and took a lot of struggle, I do think that we have a really special piece of technology at this point in time that, quite frankly, even the articles that we have out on CBS, which read like they're written by a human being, you really can't tell them apart from ones that are written by a human, which I think is actually I like to think is a pretty big deal. It's really the tip of the iceberg. I really actually think we've got something that's somewhat profound in terms of what it can really do in terms of understanding information and communicating it. And I can speak to some of the things that it's capable of later on potentially, but it's, I guess again, it's been good and bad. It was a really tough stretch to go through all of those sort of failures and just kind of wondering, is this ever going to work? Wondering if I'd really made a mistake by not pressing the pedal when we had some pretty cool competitive advantages even back right at the beginning. But I do think we have something special now. And so it's just a question of being able to grow the business and find the right applications to really show off some of the things that we're able to do.
Taken a lot of persistence, hasn't it?
It has taken a lot of persistence, and a lot more I think will still be needed before we really sort of have made it.
So you said you'd only taken friends and family money. Is that still true?
Yeah, we've been profitable, so that's good. I mean, I was just me for like about 3 years, so that makes it easier to stay profitable. But because the technology wasn't really mature, I wasn't really at the point where I could ever take money and actually put it to use, because the roadblock was just in my head. I couldn't figure out how to do things properly to get the technology to work. So, you know, unfortunately, money is not going to help with that. So for a long time, we didn't really need any money. And then once the technology was built out in 2018, we got a bunch of contracts actually. And so then we were making quite a bit of money, and we're still doing fine now. I do think that we're going to think about raising money potentially in the next half year, a year, just to kind of, not so much for the money, but just to find the right network of people who are interested in growing the business and be able to put together a real sort of board and a real marketing plan, things like that. But we've been very fortunate to not need to take any money, and we're profitable now. There's four people working at the company right now. We're working out of the Dimension Mill, which has been great. And so that's why we haven't taken money yet. And like I said, when we do take money, we hope that it will just be because we're trying to bring some people on board and give them an interest in the company to help them so that they have interest in helping us grow.
You're also in the process of applying for some grants, correct?
Yes, we applied to a lot of grants. We got a couple we got a couple Department of Defense grants late last year, which have been really helpful. And of course, Elevate Ventures also helping us with matching grants. We've applied to a lot of grants so far this year, but we have been unsuccessful so far. So we're hoping that turns around here pretty soon. We've got a lot of grants in the pipeline, and we've really sort of, the good thing about our technology is it applies to anywhere where people have a lot of structured data that they'd like to have analyzed and reported on, and that applies to almost any industry. So we could, if there's any government agency that has any sort of data related issue, we can usually try to wedge ourselves in there, and we've come up with a pretty good template for how we can talk about our technology. And so we've been able to reuse a lot of the things that we built out for other grants and just spin them out into new grants. And so we hope that we'll have a little bit of success with that. That's one of the attack vectors that we're trying to use to grow the business.
So I could see that being a challenge, that you have so many applications that it's hard to figure out where to concentrate your marketing attention. Yeah, how have you sort of tried to narrow your focus?
I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that we haven't. We needed to, but we're still at the point where as long as it's profitable, we'd kind of probably just do it at this point. Like we sort of don't know where the big money's going to come from. And it might come from an odd place. It might come from a project that we think is actually pretty small and narrow. And then it turns out that it leads us to something much bigger. So I think it'd be hard for us to understand how to narrow down our options. And to the extent that we could do that, I don't have the capability to do it. So if anybody has any suggestions, I'll definitely take them. But for right now, we're just trying to reach out to everybody. I mean, we're talking to people in the healthcare industry to do other healthcare products. We're talking to other people in the finance industry. We're talking to a lot of government entities. We're talking to local governments. I mean, we're talking to everybody that we can to try to get our story out there and try to just find new applications.
Did you ever practice law?
No, I never did. I did finish school, but I never practiced law. I never took the bar.
How'd you get to Indiana?
I came out here when I got married, actually.
Yeah. Have you found the support you need to grow your business right here in your own backyard?
Yes, definitely. That's an unqualified yes. The Dimension Mill has been great. Sci has been great. It's just I really think it's come from the Dimension Mill mostly, is just talking to people and sharing what we're doing, hearing what they're doing, making those connections. And so many people have just, you know, they said, oh, you need to talk to so-and-so. Oh, you need to talk to so-and-so. And then you talk to them and they give you a bunch of connections as well. And so we have felt very fortunate in how much help that we have received from the community here.
That's awesome. What questions do those of you on the call have for Steve today? Don't be shy.
One of the things I always point out to people when I'm talking about their company is if you are like reading articles on CBS Sports and it says staff writer, that was actually probably their AI that wrote it. If it doesn't actually have a name attached to it, it was probably their, and the majority of people would never even know that it wasn't written by somebody.
I think it's interesting, as somebody who has sort of worked in journalism, that your sort of editors are called narrative engineers. Can you talk about that? Like what your thought process was and why aren't they called editors? Or
I think because they're an intermediary. They're, you know, the computer does the writing, and then there's the code that creates that's our tech stack. But in the middle, you have to have a foot in both camps, right? You have to sort of understand how to build something in code, and you have to understand how to write, because the computer is not going to write any better than you. So, you know, it's only going to write worse. So you have to, if you're not a good writer, you're not going to come up with, the computer isn't going to assemble something that's good. So it's a tricky thing to do, but, and it'll be interesting as we scale more, how we go about identifying people who can do it. But it's definitely, I don't think you have to, it's not like a unique talent, but it's something where it's not going to be, they're not going to be a dime a dozen necessarily, the people who can do it. The good thing is you don't need any training, so we can probably just hire people right out of college, just try to find, you know, these, you know, smart people right out of college and then give them the training that they need. So that's beneficial, but you do need to have the ability to do two things that not a lot of people necessarily have the ability to do.
and it's not like you have to be an expert on baseball or soybean futures.
No, but you kind of have to become one. You have to be able to become an expert on whatever you're writing, because again, the computer is not going to be any more of an expert than you. So because you're teaching the computer everything that you know, and so you have to become an expert on whatever subject matter you're reporting on.
I think it's really interesting that you've got an English background and this programming, and that you're combining that. I just think it's ingenious. How much of a data set does somebody have to be able to start playing with it? I mean, if you're don't have all the statistics of sports, you know, if this has some potential, how much of a data set might somebody need to be able to work with you to apply it to something?
I think you have to have a data set that's pretty complicated in order for it to make economic sense for us to do what we do. Because if you have a data set that can be distilled down to something pretty simplistic, then, you know, maybe it can be distilled down to a couple numbers, or maybe even a couple sentences that you could pretty much just put into a template, then it wouldn't make sense to use our technology. I say that our technology works best when you have a situation where there's 1,000 things that could happen, 100 things that did happen, and then you want to talk about the 10 most interesting ones. So that's the case with sports, is an easy example. There's a whole host of things that could happen within the data. There's only some subset of that actually happened, but then you can't talk about everything. You can't talk about every single play, every single player, you know, so you need to talk about the most important things that happen. And that's where our system comes into play, is really synthesizing the information that's out there into something that's easy to read and compelling.
So some of the things that we're working on is really around trying to understand some of the economic factors in like for the COVID and the pandemic. So there is a lot of data out there, but trying to figure out how to make it, say, relevant to Bartholomew County or Southeast Indiana, you know. So some of the information, it might be more unstructured. I don't know, because some of this information is out there, but how do you then bring it into a story is some of the stuff we're working on. And just kind of curious if these kinds of tools would be applicable or maybe not. I don't, you know.
I think that they could be. That it's certainly something that we could do. Again, it depends on the specific story that you wanted to tell. If there were sort of a couple points that you always wanted to hit, then again, you could kind of use a template system to do that. If the story's more complex, then that's something that we can absolutely do. And in fact, one of the grants that we have applied for is to use COVID data, more on the health side, but basically to pull in a lot of information that's out there, including things like you can search Twitter, Google Trends, other things for people searching for the flu or mentioning the flu or mentioning that they're sick. And there's a lot of third-party data like that could also go in with the existing data on COVID that can really act as a warning, as a very early warning to local areas that they're going to have problems with coronavirus and potential other viruses in the future. And so our system would be really good for that, because again, you have all these different data sources, things are happening in all of them, and you have to synthesize that down to something that's relatively easy to read. And so we've applied for a grant for that, but the economic data is something that we could potentially do as well, where you have a lot of different sources of economic data, and you got to synthesize it down to what's the story, like what is it that you as an individual need to read. And I would say this because this is another aspect of the technology that's pretty tricky that people don't generally intuitively understand, is that if you've got one report that you're reading every day or every week, it's not enough to just generate the most interesting information out of the data set. You have to take into account the reader. And this reader has already read the report that came out yesterday or came out a week ago. And so because of that, the report has to reflect the things that you already talked about. Because something could be really interesting, but if you mentioned it 5 days in a row, it's not interesting anymore, right? And that gets really tricky because it's not as simple as just saying, oh, well, I mentioned this exact thing. You could mention something that's conceptually similar or something that's really tied into it, right? Where it's like, yeah, you didn't mention this exact thing, but you mentioned something that basically means that this other thing's going to happen too, right? So you have to understand conceptually what you've talked about, and that gets really tricky, but we have techniques to deal with that and that are really valuable in the situation like you're talking about, where you're going to be reading something in a series.
Good. Yeah, very interesting. Kudos. Yeah, very interesting.
Thank you.
Other questions?
So I kind of want to, they started to mention a little bit about the question that I had. So I'm like sitting here thinking, you know, when I type on my computer, I can't tell you how many errors I make. So what is the likelihood, or what is the technique that you use to prevent errors in the writing? I'm like, I could accidentally, you know, put something that means something completely different in context of an article or a writing. How do you eliminate that error factor? I mean, does a human actually review the writing prior to it being, I guess, flipped?
Generally, no. That's a very good question. We don't review, once we go into production, we don't generally review the articles before they go out. We do have a review process of looking at what we've already posted to check for those types of errors. But basically, we have part of our tech stack is a system that can run, let's say, hundreds of commodity reports and put them all in one spot. And then we have people review what was written up, and we look for those types of errors. We do sometimes have spelling errors. More often they're sort of conceptual errors where it's writing about something that doesn't really make sense, or it's sort of stepping on itself. And that's where we then, go back and re-engineer the components to make sure that they're accurate. So it doesn't take place prior to production because there's just too many things that we're producing. Like during when all of our sports overlap on CBS, for instance, we're producing about 5,000 articles a week. And because we cover college sports, we do like gambling focused articles, we do in-game reports, like quarter by quarter, we post things. So there's all sorts of different reports that are going off at once. So we don't have the ability to check what we're doing before posting, but we do have pretty robust procedures to try to do as much checking as we can before we turn the light on.
Steve, I'm curious what your fee structure looks like. What would you base it on if you have a contract with someone? Size of data, number of hours?
That's a great question. I don't really know. We kind of, it's at a base level, it's about how complicated is it to build the narratives. And then there's also an element of how many people is this going out to, right? That's an aspect as well. But essentially, because this business is pretty new and not a lot of people are using it, it's not a commodity in terms of other people necessarily being able to jump in and offer what we're doing. It's more about how much value is there. You know, even if something was really simple, if it was generating a ton of value, then that's what we try to charge. So we don't exactly know that, you know, ourselves, how much value is necessarily there, but it is something that we'd like to, like typically right now we just do like an annual licensing fee. That's what we have with all of our clients currently. But we'd really like to start doing some more revenue sharing structures where we say, hey, we think we're going to be able to deliver X number of views or X number of sales, or your customer retention is going to go up to this level, and sort of participate on that basis. But we haven't had the chance to do that yet, but we hope to be able to do that in the future.
That would be a game changer, wouldn't it?
I hope so.
I have a quick question. This is Bob with the Chamber. Can you talk about the pandemic? I know it completely shut down of sports. What has that really done to your business?
I think I'm hopeful at this point that it's not going to really affect us too much financially, because our sports client is CBS. Well, we actually have a client called Max Preps, which is a division of CBS that's high school sports. They're obviously a gigantic company, so they're not going to go out of business. As far as I know, they're not going to cut back on what we're doing. We have a contract with them through the middle of next year. I would say that the biggest impact on our business has sort of been pretty bad timing, because as I said, the company was frozen for about 5 years, and then we had about another year where we had this technology and we're proving it on a small scale. And then, you know, around the beginning of this year, it's like, all right, here we go. We're going to go big and we're going to tell everybody about what we're doing. And then coronavirus hit. And so, you know, I was planning on going to a lot of conferences, just getting out there and talking to people. And that's not an option. So, you know, that hasn't obviously closed down all the avenues to talk to people. I'm talking to people right now. And, you know, I spoke at a conference virtually, but, you know, that's not the same. And so I think so far, knock on wood, the big impact has not necessarily been financial. It's more been the ability to grow the business. And even within CBS, we were negotiating adding baseball, you know, right in the beginning of late February, and that's, you know, been completely shelved. So it has affected our ability to grow within the sports world, but just sort of everywhere, because it's just difficult making those connections that you need to make.
Does anybody have another question?
Maybe we can talk about a few of the other ways that you can or have used the tech, like the one you're talking about with Jonathan about the guidance counselors at colleges.
Yeah, that was an application that we applied to the Department of Education, which unfortunately was rejected. But again, we're spinning it into other grants. But basically, the problem that exists right now for college advisors is that they have a very limited amount of time to meet with each one of their students, and the data about their students is siloed in all these different places. So they have to sort of hunt and peck for information. They don't have any ability to really dive in deep and figure out, you know, has a student, has their progress stalled? Is there a particular line of coursework that they're having difficulty with? Has their financial aid application changed, you know, in recent times? All these little things that are really valuable are buried, you know, very deep into a particular silo. And so what we propose doing is to use our natural language generation software to synthesize the information and actually create a really interactive dashboard that doesn't just have a narrative, but also has targeted pieces of data visualizations. So charts, graphs, tables, right? So that instead of having to hunt and peck for the most important information, you get a nice, easy story that's really digestible. And then the important pieces of information that you might want to dive into are right there, so that you can see them and do the exploring on your own. And that general idea of a dashboard is something that we'd like to be able to do more of. It's more of a sort of business intelligence in that vein, right? Or a lot of people doing dashboards, but we think that the ability to synthesize information and have not just a static dashboard, but actually have a dashboard where whatever the charts and graphs are that you're seeing are the things that just happen to be the most important information. That something like that has a lot of applications in a lot of different places. And as Sai mentioned, one of the ones we think that could be very helpful is helping student advisors really understand the story behind the student that they're about to see.
That's cool. So it's 8:59. I just want to close with one more question, and that is, what's your end game? Do you want to sell this for millions of dollars? Do you want to keep managing this and see where it goes for the next 25 years? What does success look like to you, Steve?
I would love to sell it for millions of dollars. That sounds great.
Cool. Okay, good luck. Good luck.
Yeah, thanks. I'll need it.
Thank you for sharing your story with us. And thank you, 49ers, for being with us. And reminder, we'll be at the workshop in Columbus next week, and we'll have an online version, and we'll have a couple seats for some folks who want to be there in person. So stay tuned for more information about that. And you all have a great Friday, okay?
Thank you all for your time.
Thanks, Steve.
Bye-bye.